Unlike Bobby Bird, who failed to substantiate his 1971 claim, "I know you got soul," with even a single shred of evidence, I intend to make the opposite claim: "I know you haven't got soul." And unlike Mr. Bird all those years ago, I intend to justify my conclusion that an immortal, immaterial soul is an unfeasible proposition. To do this, I intend to present a series of arguments encapsulated within 4 problems. So let us deal with these problems in turn. Homo sapiens, you and I, are the result of hundreds of millions of years of undirected evolutionary change, an unbroken lineage linking us to the very simplest of organisms. To believe in an immaterial soul, you are therefore required to hold one of 2 positions. The first position is to assert that all life forms possess a soul, all the way through from the most complex animals through to yeasts, plants and bacteria. Moreover, as the soul is not passed on via reproduction but is imbued into each life form by the proposed God, this renders it out of reach of the evolutionary pressures of natural selection. As a result, it would require a process of constant alteration, tweaking and tinkering on the part of God in a bid to constantly upgrade and re-engineer suitable souls for each and every evolutionary step. Of course, this is not the position most commonly held, and so is usually circumvented. The second, more favoured explanation is that humans are special, in either being the only species to possess a soul or in possessing a soul with characteristics not granted to other life forms. To give you an idea, Thomas Aquinas, taking his cue from Aristotle, believed all plants and animals possessed a soul, but only man had a rational, immaterial soul directly created by God. Likewise, in 1996, Pope John Paul II, following the teachings of Pope Pius XIII, said, "If the origins of the human body come through living matter which existed previously, the spiritual soul is created directly by God." And finally, Francis S. Collins, one-time head of the Human Genome Project, wrote in his recent book that Adam and Eve is a symbolic allegory of the entrance of the human soul into a previously soulless animal kingdom. To sum up here, the position we are being asked to entertain is that sometime since our lineage split from that of the chimpanzees 6 million years ago, God decided to set a date after which he began allocating a soul to every developing proto-human embryo. Of course, injecting the controlling hand of an immaterial soul into an organism already evolved for complex decision-making, as all great apes are, is a recipe for huge internal conflict. It would clearly be necessary for God to alter the DNA to remove all those pre-existing structures from the ape's brain for which the immaterial soul would now take over from. Tellingly, we see no such major rewiring of the brain, nor do we see any evidence in the genetic record to correspond with such a momentous and instantaneous suppression and reconfiguration of the role of the brain. It is not only in the evolutionary context that the injection of a soul, where previously there were none, presents so many problems. In fact, the phylogenetic problems mentioned already are, in many ways, overshadowed by those that are thrown up each and every time a human egg is fertilized. The problem in question concerns the moment of ensoulment, the exact moment in which the immaterial soul is married to the new genetic deck which the 2 prospective parents have so enthusiastically shuffled and dealt. By far the most common viewpoint is that the moment of ensoulment corresponds with the moment of conception. On the face of it, this seems a straightforward enough proposition. However, conception is not so cut and dried as you might think. For starters, several sperm may penetrate the egg, and it may take some time for the surplus genetic material to be ejected. Add to this that the genetic payload of the sperm may then remain separate from that of the egg for a day or more, and then a further period of time may go by for the new genome to take control of the egg, and we start to see that the idea of a moment of conception is nothing of the sort. Even after conception is finalised, things don't get much better. Worryingly, over 2/3 of conceptuses never implant in the uterus and are spontaneously aborted without us ever realising. So what happens to these souls? Are they sent off to heaven or hell, judged by God, without even getting the chance to sin in the womb? Or does God constantly recycle these souls, sending them to fertilised egg after fertilised egg, until eventually each soul strikes it lucky? And please, do not be under any illusion that this is the most major problem faced by the process of ensoulment. Not by a long way. Over the next few days, the burgeoning embryo can potentially split into 2 or 3 clones. So what is the fate for these identical twins and triplets that result? Do they somehow manage on a half or third of a soul each, or does God intervene once again, allocating the original soul to one of the embryos and a fresh soul to its womb mate? The worst is yet to come. Occasionally, 2 eggs can become fertilised, but instead of developing into fraternal twins, they can end up merging to create an individual with a chimeric mix of 2 genomes. One can but wonder whether such an individual would therefore possess 2 souls, and would a good soul be held responsible for the deeds committed if partnered by a roguish soul acting in the same body? I think it is fair to say that by now any deity worth his salt would be beginning to wonder whether the idea of injecting souls into organisms that had prospered for so long without them was such a good idea after all. But let's put all these difficulties and objections to one side and consider what having an immaterial soul would actually be like. Although we may know nothing about the soul itself, one undeniable fact is that for a supernatural soul to have any bearing over our material bodies, it has to interact with our brains, and this brings us to the third of our problems, the problem of dualistic control. One thing we know is that our brains are organs made of the same mundane atomic stuff as the rest of our world, and the same mundane atomic stuff as the laboratory equipment that souls seemingly always manage to avoid detection by. To quote the philosopher Dennett, how can mind stuff elude all physical measurement and yet control the body? So this is the problem then for our soul. For it to be able to control our body via our mind, it has to try to communicate either through materialistic means, rendering it detectable to our instruments, or non-materialistic means, rendering it undetectable by our material brains. We know that science has failed spectacularly to detect any such materialistic communication, which leaves the soul in the unenviable position of having a body and a brain at its disposal, but with no viable means of instructing it. This is a real body blow for the whole idea that we could possess such a soul, as that required for most religious worldviews, including the Abrahamic ones. Another major issue with such interactions by the soul is the impact it has on the principle of conservation of energy, because physical work on the neurons of the brain takes physical energy to perform. The fact is that there is no real way round this issue. We could address it by presupposing that the soul has some reserve of mental energy to power these interactions, but then this extra energy, when transferred to the brain, would show up. Unfortunately, the alternative is even more desperate, to dispense with a well-established principle of conservation of energy, simply to allow us to shoehorn something into our worldview that we have never observed and have no evidence for. Indeed, it really does seem that maintaining a belief in an immaterial soul comes at a very high price. Finally, I should like you to consider the problem of redundancy, the issue of exactly what role is left for our soul once we take away all the functions for which we already know our brains are capable of and are performing. Students of neuroscience will already be familiar with the case of Phineas Gage, the 19th century railroad worker whose intimate experience with an iron spike left him with a perfectly functional brain but an irrevocably altered personality. We are also all acutely aware how a stroke or blow to the head can, sometimes permanently, wipe out whole tracts of our memories or the ability to retain information gathered in the present. We are also all aware of the multitudinous effects on our personalities and consciousness of taking various chemical substances, and, again, sometimes these effects can last long after the drug has left the body. Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga are 2 neuroscientists who have studied the brains of patients who, as a cure for their severe epilepsy, have had their brains cut in half at the adjoining region of the 2 hemispheres, the corpus callosum. Information was flashed to these patients so that only one hemisphere would receive it. Amongst the startling results from these series of experiments, let me highlight just one. The command walk was flashed to the right hemisphere of the patient's brain, and the patient duly got up and walked away. However, when questioned why they walked away, the left hemisphere, unaware of the command given, took over and attempted to weave a coherent narrative reporting, in all sincerity, "I'm going into the house to get a Coke." It appears via the series of experiments that the left hemisphere, when disconnected from the right, will concoct a false story to account for the decisions made by the right hemisphere. Would an immaterial soul be fooled in such a manner? It is hard to imagine how it possibly could be. Time and again through the study of other primates' brains alongside those of humans, one by one, the roles that people earnestly attributed to their immaterial souls have been shown to root firmly within the structure of the brain itself, firmly within the dangerous reach of physical trauma until almost nothing is left to constitute the soul. So where does all this leave the soul? What is left of us to drift up to heaven? My soul houses not my smile nor my laugh, my temper nor my compassion, my lusts nor my desires, my empathy nor my morality, my opinions nor the memories of the events that helped shape them. All that is left is a disembodied, mindless, characterless notion of free will. Now, if knowing that helps you sleep well at night, then don't let me shatter your illusion. But personally, I intend to hang on to my brain for as long as possible. I just get the feeling it may actually serve a purpose. Thank you for watching this video.